Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for being here with us this morning. Really excited for our training on 2025 CalGreen. Um, as I mentioned, if you have the opportunity to drop your short introduction into the chat, we'd love to know where you're from and your level of experience with CalGreen. And then I'm going to do just a quick introduction to get us started. My name is Jess Blackwell, and I work for the High Sierra Energy Foundation, which is a small nonprofit based in the Eastern Sierra. We are a founding member of the Central California Rural Regional Energy Network. And many of you, looking at the list, I think are familiar with CCR-REN and have participated in our codes and standards courses in the past. But if you're new to this space, welcome. We're really excited to have you here. Regional energy networks are essentially a framework for delivering energy efficiency programs. And regional energy networks are pretty amazing because they allow us to design programs that really serve our specific communities in ways that traditional energy efficiency programs do not. And this has led to RENs focusing often on hard to reach customers as well as disadvantaged and underserved communities. You can go ahead to the next slide. Just a little bit of background on CCR-REN and what territories we serve. The Eastern Sierra region encompasses Mono and Inyo counties, and that is where our organization sits. That's the High Sierra Energy Foundation. And we have partners in Monterey Bay for the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, in the Central Valley with San Joaquin Valley Clean Energy Organization, and then the County of San Luis Obispo is our program administrator, and County of Ventura supports us in an advisory role. And then just a little bit about our other programs. Today, we are presenting CalGreen training as part of our Codes and Standards program, which provides training and technical assistance for building professionals. We do have on-demand courses, so if you visit our website at ccrren.org/codes, you can find all of our recorded trainings and feel free to watch them at any time. We also do have the slides available as well. Our other programs include a residential program, a workforce education training program, a commercial energy improvement program, and then a public agency program that just serves Monterey Bay area local governments. And then we do have a finance program that is slated to launch later this year. And we actually have just launched, planning to launch a new strategic energy management program for seven total programs. Awesome. And then I will be passing it over to our partners at Inbalance Green Consulting, who will be leading today's training. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess, and the High Sierra Energy Foundation. I'm Andy Pease. I'm an architect and lead accredited professional with Inbalance Green Consulting. I'm here with Tatiana Soglin, also a lead accredited professional, and we're pleased and proud to be partners with CCR-REN to be able to provide training in Energy Code, CalGreen Code, and other supportive services within those code sectors. So here's our learning objectives for today. We are focusing on the 2025 CalGreen. We did offer a similar course about this time last year, and so some of that will be familiar that hasn't changed between the codes, but we'll definitely be highlighting what the changes are. This is a full hour and a half learning units, and it's a little dense. You do get the slides, so don't worry if you're not missing catching every detail. You'll get the slides. The recording will be available. We love questions, so go ahead and put them in the chat, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end to explore any of the bigger questions. All right, with that, let's jump in. So the intent of CalGreen is a baseline green building code, and its intent is to kind of raise the bar for all of green building, but make it at an approachable level. So there's a mandatory level that everybody has to do, and then there are reach codes that are available for individual jurisdictions to establish if they choose use that for their community. We're mostly going to focus today on this mandatory measures so that you know what's required within the residential and non-residential sections. So the energy code started many, many years ago in the 70s. And then in the late 2000s, or just before the turn of the century there, LEED was established. Early 2000s is when that was kind of taking off. And then CalGreen came another decade after that. And happily, the state framed the CalGreen like LEED certification. So the same kind of categories, and it made it a very fluid process to adopt those for those who were already in the green building world. So every 3 years, just like all the rest of the codes, it gets an update, and it's pretty targeted. So you'll see where they're hitting that up. The building standards overall, Title 24, has all of these 12 parts, 12 and a half, depending on how you count them. We're in part 11, the California Green Building Standards Code, not to be confused with part 6. We get that a fair amount where we say, the Energy Code, Title 24, CalGreen, and they kind of conflate the two. Different code sections, there is a little bit of overlap and coordination. It's surprisingly actually pretty well coordinated across all the parts of the Title 24 building standards. When you are going through CalGreen, make sure that you look to see where your particular project has applicability. So basically, the residential section is managed by Housing and Community Development, HCD, whereas the non-residential section is the Building Standards Commission, BSC. In fact, you even have to go to different websites to get the guidelines. And then DSA for schools, and then we have OSHPOD for some limited sections as well, although increasingly across the board, we're seeing more of that. So at the start of each section, there's an adoption table, and then within even the code itself, there's some labeling, so you can keep that straight. Here's the organization of CalGreen. So first one, administration, definitions, pretty standard. Green building scope, we'll touch on that, what projects are going to apply for this code. And then the bulk of our discussion is about chapters 4 and 5. Those are the residential mandatory measures and non-residential mandatory measures. We'll touch on some of the other sections toward the end so you can see the different resources available. Okay, so the scope is first, it's all new construction, residential and non-residential. But then if you're doing an addition or an alteration, it varies a little bit for res or non-res. For a residential project, if you're doing an addition or alteration that adds area or volume, right, then that will trigger CalGreen. Now note, it's only the parts that are new work that require that attention. So in residential, it doesn't mean you have to, or non-res, you don't have to bring the rest of your project up to a CalGreen standard. It's only the new work. In residential, the multifamily parking lots now trigger, if you do an alteration of a certain size and scale, that will trigger CalGreen. In the non-residential, they give you a bit of a pass for an addition that's under 1,000 square feet, or an alteration that has a permit valuation less than 200,000. 200,000 is a fixed amount, so it hasn't gone up since its initial adoption in 15 years ago. So most projects end up going that. And similar to the residential, the parking lot will have an alteration requirement that will trigger CalGreen for EV parking. A couple of just side notes on that scope. If you have a mixed occupancy, then you res and non-res, then you need a checklist for each. So you need to comply depending on the section. So hotels that might have a commercial area down below will need residential for the actual rooms and non-res for the retail, if there is retail. For mid-rise, high-rise housing, similarly, if you have kind of third-party coffee shop or something like that, that will trigger CalGreen non-res. But if it's just a community room, that can stay in the residential. For phased projects, shell buildings, kind of interesting, right? So just the scope that's within the shell needs to be CalGreen compliant. Then that initial tenant improvement counts as new construction, and whatever is that needs to be CalGreen compliant. And then the next TI is going to count as an alteration, right? So, but you can't just get the shell done and then not do CalGreen for the fit up. All right. And what does CalGreen compliance look like? The AEIA has these awesome plan sheets, and they have updated it for the 2025 code. So it's 24 by 36. You put them in your plan set. In and of itself, this does not count. You need to do the effort of adding a note of saying either yes or no, it comply, or yes or not applicable. And then you need to reference the sheet. So if there's a requirement about bike racks, then you say yes, and then you point them to the sheet that shows the bike rack, both the calculation and the detail and location. Okay, so then we're going to dive into the mandatory measures. Any questions so far? Doing okay? Tatiana's monitoring for us, so all right, great. We're going to go through the 5 divisions. There's a great parallel between the residential and the non-residential, so we're going to put them both as we go through, and we'll just highlight when they are different from each other. We'll go ahead and have at the bottom corner is the actual code reference. If it starts with a 4, it's residential. If it starts with a 5, it's non-residential. And then we'll add in these gray boxes kind of notes about the documentation. So what you should be either putting on your plans as the design team or looking for if you're on the plan reviewing side. Okay. First up is res and non-res stormwater pollution prevention during construction. If you're over an acre, there's a formal path through the water board, but CalGreen does kind of scoop up the less than an acre. And it's all the things that you would think of in terms of erosion control and making sure that you have the straw wattles, et cetera, to prevent contaminant of your soils into the stormwater system. And then for the over an acre, it just reiterates that you're complying with the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, and that has a whole documentation requirement in and of itself for SWIP, et cetera. And so the documentation, you should be making sure that you have a sheet that shows your erosion control depending on what the project is. But for new construction where there is going to be site disruption, you should have a pollution, an erosion control, dust control, sedimentation control plan. And within that, kind of the corollary is that the grading and pavement for the permanent construction. So the first one was about construction itself. Then once the thing is built, you need to have water both leaving, not entering the building. So you should make sure that you show the slope away from the building of any paving. And then that the flat work, or that the flat work tilting and the landscaping should capture the rainwater on site with swales, other strategies, and specifically says to recharge groundwater. Obviously, if you're doing an addition or an alteration, it doesn't trigger retroactively having to update the stormwater if you're not impacting that area. All right, so bicycle parking, a little bit different for residential and non-residential. On the non-residential side, permanent racks within 200 feet of the visitor's entrance. They should be easily visible, at least 2 bikes minimum, and then it's 20% of peak daily visitors. So you just need to check to see if you're a retail store or a medical or some kind of an office with hardly any visitors. It's your tale to tell how many visitors it's going to be. And then long term, that's for our employees. They don't want to just have their nice bikes parked out in bike racks out in the front. So you need to have long term bike parking. Also needs to be easily accessible, and it's again based on how many tenant occupants, meaning those employees, whether employee is volunteer or permanent, paid. So 10% of tenant occupants that are being added for an alteration. And then new shell in a phased project, you still have to put in the bike racks, even though you don't know what's going to be in there. So make your best assumptions for that. And a minimum of one long-term bike parking. So this is new for 2025 and 2022 code. It was a percent of vehicle parking, but they were finding that if people hardly put any parking, then they hardly got any bike racks. So that was kind of counterproductive. So now it's based on number of visitors and occupants. Residential is similar in that you need to have those visitor parkings, one space for every 10,000 square feet. So for a hotel or an apartment building. And then for long-term, for multifamily buildings, one parking space for every 2 dwelling units, right? So a lot of times we'll find folks doing a bike room and just making sure that they have the bike racks within that bike room so that there's one per dwelling unit. Hotel motels in that case is going to be a little bit different, obviously, because not as many people are going to have their own bikes. So it's based on the square footage with a minimum of 2 spaces. So 2022 code, there wasn't any residential requirement at all. And we found that a lot of jurisdictions had their own, but it wasn't consistent. So it's important now that CalGreen has consistent residential bike parking requirements. Just as aside from experience, you're probably seeing a lot more electric bikes now, and also with long cargo racks for kids and groceries, etc. So unless you want a whole bunch of bikes scattered around your building without a bike rack, just make sure you allow enough length in front of bike racks. It's different than it was 10 years ago, right? I don't know. Put in the chat if you have an e-bike. I'm loving those things. I get everywhere on it. Public schools, as you can imagine, have a slightly higher requirement in terms of both student parking and staff parking. So on the plan sheets, you should show your calculations. You should show the bike racks and the bike type, where it is on the plans with the details and specifications, and just make it easy for the planning department. Show your math. How are you lining this up? How many visitors? How many occupants? The whole long-term parking, what does that look like? It needs to be covered, lockable enclosure with permanently anchored racks. Okay, so it works to do like in a parking garage. You can have a little gated area that maybe tenants have a key to, or a room. You can do these outside bike lockers, bike lockers with a view of in San Luis Obispo. And then these are a no or a maybe, right? This is kind of open to everybody. So if this was the long-term rack, it's, might be difficult. Maybe that's a visitor rack and that's okay. Or maybe the garage is only admitted. So that's a little bit of a maybe. This one is loose. It's not actually, the rack itself is not anchored to the ground. So that wouldn't count. All right. Phew. Electric vehicle charging. Okay, this is the hardest one. So we're going to spend a little bit of time because one, it's changed, and two, it has a lot of parts and pieces to it. So we'll talk about defining the different EV charging parts and pieces. Then we'll go over single family, multifamily, and non-res. And now a newer section from the prior code cycle about medium and heavy duty truck charging. And then a special thought about additions and alterations to existing parking lots. Okay. So 3 types of charging designations. So the first is EV capable. That's the easiest, is just empty conduit. And it goes to a panel and it has a box, just a junction box, so that there's not even wiring in it. And this is often used for like single family residential construction because they want to make it easy if you want to put in a charger in the future, but they also don't want to have wiring in there if you don't need it, because that's kind of a wasted resource of that copper to just to have it not be utilized. So EV capable, that's the lowest level. Then EV ready is one that's going to have a conduit and a wire and a receptacle. So it's ready to receive somebody else's kind of charger with a plug, an outlet. Okay. And then the highest one is the EV charging station, the level 2 EV charging station. So it's not the total trickle of a little residential, but it's not necessarily that high speed one. So, but it is a charger that you could then plug into the car rather than the other way around. Okay, here's what they look like visually. This is that residential one I was mentioning. You just plug it into a regular outlet, and then this is the device that you put into your car. Level 2 is this is the actual charger that is required by the CALGreen code when you need a charger. It can be this simple, so it's just a little charger, and then this is the device that you plug into your car. Level 3 DC fast chargers, those are allowed by code, but they are not required by code. So if you're on the road and traveling with an electric car, you know that these are the kind you want to find. Electrify America, ChargePoint, etc. But CalGreen does not require that. Within the world of level 2, it gets even more confusing because there's actually two different types. There's a regular level 2 that we've already talked about, but then there's a low power level 2. This is a 20 amp, so it's more than the little level 1s, but it's still a receptacle. So these are EV ready. So you would be having the outlet is what you are providing as part of a low power level 2. So it can plug. And if you're in a situation where it's a multifamily, you are allowed to charge for the electricity you're using. Obviously, like a charge point, that already has a well-established system, but the market has responded and figured out a way that you can also charge for access to an outlet. So the receptacle, you can, if there's unassigned multifamily parking, you can still have cost recovery for the owner. And whether it's a future installed, they have slightly, they're going to have different labeling requirements. If it's a future space, EV capable, you're going to want to label the breaker. You're going to want to label the box on the other side. Don't label the parking stall. It's just for EV ready, EV capable. But if you are putting in an EV space, then you should be putting the label EV charging only on that parking space. Okay. Now the EV charging itself for single family, that hasn't changed for a couple cycles. So 1 and 2 family dwelling townhouses with attached private garage. So in that case, it's just that EV capable, just the conduit, no charger, no wire. Same. It is not required for ADUs and JADUs. In multifamily, now it is 1 low power level 2 EV charging receptacle for every unit. This is a big change. And if it's fewer spaces than units, and we'll go through an example, then it's all of the spaces, right? And if you've got more used parking spaces than units, then 25% of those have to have actual EV chargers. And note that if possible, the EV charging receptacles for an assigned a space to a unit, it should be wired to that dwelling unit so that that customer, that occupant's electric bill includes the electricity for charging their vehicles. So again, makes sense, but not always feasible. So they say there's a little bit of discretion that can be used to see. So ideally, it's assigned and goes to that tenant. Okay, so this is a change. 2022 code was already a bump at the intervening code cycle, but the last code ended up with 40% of those multifamily spaces should be low power level 2 plus 10%. Now it's all low power level 2 plus that 25%. So you can see California is putting a big focus on electrification of our fleet. Within that, here's just kind of a little decision tree for multifamily parking. If it's provided and assigned, then one low power receptacle per unit. Okay, that kind of makes sense, right? If it's unassigned or mixed and you have fewer spaces than units, then all of those will have it, or equal or more. Then it varies depending if they're assigned or unassigned. So here's the example. Number of units, if you have 200 units but only 150 parking spaces, you need 150 low voltage, so the receptacles, and no chargers. 200 units with 240 parking spaces, then you need 200. You don't have to go more than that. But because all of the spaces are assigned to units, it still doesn't re-trigger EV charging. But if you do 200 units and they're unassigned, then that maxes out at 200. But whatever is not a unit count does need chargers. I apologize if that is a lot, and please reach out to the code coach if you have a specific instance. Phew. Okay, EV charging for hotels and motels, similar to the 2022 code. It doesn't go to the new multifamily one. It's just 40% low power level 2 EV charging receptacle, and 25% are actual EV chargers. Okay, now we're going into non-residential EV charging. And in this case, I'm showing the 2022 code, which shows based on the total number of spaces, how many are EV capable, how many have charging stations. And note that the process is that the EV capable, if you have 8, and then 2 of those need to have charging stations. So it's actually, you end up with 6 EV capable and 2 charging stations. I don't know why they do that. I should maybe make a suggestion that they clean up that language a little bit because it's kind of confusing. So now this is the 2025 code. Again, you can see the EV capable and charging stations has now gone up. And they've added a section for retail and office because they were finding that they needed more actual charging stations in those scenarios. So they trigger more. So again, if you have 80 parking spaces, you need 17 that are EV capable, but 8 of those are going to be charging stations. Or if you're in an office, you've got 13 of those, and then you just leave 4 as EV capable. There's alternative approaches. That's kind of a prescriptive using that table, but they also let you do some trade-offs. They're trying to accommodate changing technology and market. So if you have you have DC fast chargers, they count as 5 level 2s. So if you were required to do 10 level 2 chargers, you could take away 5 of them and put in 1 DC fast charger. Or the opposite, if you're doing a whole bunch of low power level 2s, then you would need twice as many. And then there's also this power allocation method, and I've seen that used once or twice, but again, it's kind of a little bit of a mix and match. So if you follow it prescriptively, that's the right power allocation, but you can get to it from different directions in your mix and match. If you are using fast chargers, you need to have at least 1 charger, must be a regular level 2, because not every car can accommodate those fast chargers. And then within that new construction world is accessibility, ADA access compliance. And so all the charging stations, so not the receptacles, but actual charging stations that are for non-residential uses, hotels, motels, public housing, they have to comply with the California Building Code Chapter 11B. So that's, we're kind of all used to doing that. But again, it's for the actual charging equipment, not the low power level receptacles. But in this code cycle, they've added CalGreen includes similar provisions for multifamily because Chapter 11B does not cover the multifamily. And so CalGreen now has the similar requirements in terms of number of station or number of ADA. It has to be van accessible. It has to be, an 8-foot wide loading area, et cetera. So the shorthand is that if you have an EV charging station, that it needs to be accessible, right? So even just one, it's going to be van accessible in all those instances. Okay, and then just kind of wrapping up the specific charging requirements, medium and heavy duty charging. We're trying to have select commercial uses have capacity in their raceways, their transformers, and their panels so that in the future that they would be able to be charging stations. So they're not, again, requiring actual wires, but they need to be capable. And so it's based on, it was just a few of these, but then they've added additional building types. So grocery, manufacturing, office, retail, and warehouse. Again, the bigger ones are going to have trucks, and then it has kind of the panel capacity. Public schools, similar approach, slightly updated table as that goes. All right, and then the parking lot additions and alterations. And so for a multifamily residential project or a hotel motel, if you are adding parking facilities or if you are doing an alteration of an existing parking that is going to tear it up in some way. So, which includes like electrical and lighting systems, or if you're just tearing up the whole thing, that's an alteration. That all new altered spaces must be EV ready or EVCS up to the point where it goes, tips into that one per unit, right? So if you have an apartment building with 200 units and you are altering the parking lot, but it only has 150, then you have to do all 150. But if it's altering to 250, then you still only have to do the 200 that lines up with a multifamily. If you are just resurfacing, restriping, planting, any of those things, those do not trigger it. Those are just alterations and maintenance. For non-res projects, when your parking is added or electrical work is done, you upgrade all those existing EV capable with EV charging stations. Or you just add the EV charging stations according to the formulas that we've already talked about. So 2022 code, it was less. So upgrade 10% of altered spaces, and the new code, you're upgrading all of them. This is kind of a clarification because this comes up a lot, is if you are adding PVs to an existing parking lot, it does trigger the EV charging requirements, but only for those spaces directly under the canopy. There was a concern that we were getting where people are like, I'm just adding PVs for this one section. Does that mean I'm altering the whole parking lot? And in the intervening code cycle, they're coming up with a clarification that says, no, it's just the alteration is only for the part under the canopy. And then the documentation for EVs is making sure, again, make it easy for the plans examiners, have the calculations on your cover sheet with the breakdown of each type. Um, there's you can if you are labeling on the site plan, then you can, this is kind of for the plans examiners to know where these spaces are so that they can count and make sure they're all accommodated. Whereas in this one, it's a civil plan, a paving plan, where they're communicating to the contractor what the striping is supposed to be. So these might show up, they can show up on the same plan, but just make sure there's clarity that the contractor doesn't think that they need to stripe EVCS ready, right? This is the striping part of it. Again, these are lessons learned in the field. And sufficient capacity in the panels on the electrical sheets. So got to make sure that that is available. Yeah, assuming that there is adequate electrical service. So that's a conversation. Okay, phew, that's the hardest one, EV charging. So now we're going on to some of the more straightforward. Light pollution is, again, hasn't really changed. We have backlight, uplight, and glare settings. And so it depends on how urban the site is, the lighting zone. A lot of jurisdictions have stricter compliance for that. But if it's a really low lumen fixture, it aligns with the energy code. So 6,200 initial lumens or less than that, then it doesn't trigger CALGreen either. That used to be a conflict in the codes. So just make sure that the lighting schedule provided on the site plan or electrical sheets calls out the bug rating or shows the lumens and the exemption. And then also within the this 5.1 section is DSA. If you're doing schools, they do require shade trees, depending on parking, landscape, hardscape areas. And that is it for the planning and design section. Any questions, comments, stories to be told? Okay.
Nothing
No?
showing up in the chat so
All
far.
right. That's all right. Okay, so here's the energy efficiency section of CalGreen. It says you must comply with Title 24, Part 6, and that's it, truly. And now we go on to water. And I'll turn that over to Tatiana.
Thanks, Andy. So the requirements for plumbing fixtures and fittings are pretty straightforward, and these have not changed in the 2025 code update. This chart shows the allowed flush or flow rates in gallons per minute, gallons per flush, or gallons per cycle for the different fixture types. An important thing to pay attention to are things like water sense labels for toilets and shower heads. And we want to make note of this residential bathroom faucet. It has a maximum of 1.2 gallons per minute, but it's also the only fixture with a minimum rate of 0.8. So sometimes in mixed use buildings, there will be a blanket 0.5 gallons per minute faucet put in for all lavatory faucets, but it wouldn't meet the requirement for the residential spaces. So we want to make sure we're hitting that threshold where it's required. There are mandatory measures related to water submeters. We put together this decision tree to help determine if submeters are required depending on the project type. For non-residential projects, a new construction project or addition over 50,000 square feet needs a submeter if you have a use over 100 gallons per day. If it is less than 50,000 square feet, you don't need a submeter unless the use is considered excessive consumption, which is over 1,000 gallons per day. That could be something like a building with a restaurant or a laundromat. In those cases, you would need submeters. For multifamily, all units must be submetered per the plumbing code, and this also includes ADUs. So, as a reminder, projects are considered multifamily if it is 2 units or more, so those would need separate submeters to help with accountability for water use and for billing. Food waste disposers also have a gallons per minute maximum threshold. They must be less than 1 gallon per minute when not in use, or an automatic shutoff after 10 minutes of inactivity. And they must be less than 8 gallons per minute when in use. And all of this needs to be included in the fixture schedule. For landscaping and outdoor water use, you'll use the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, or MWELO for short. This is a tool for looking at outdoor water use for landscapes over 500 square feet. You'll need a table similar to this one. It doesn't necessarily need to be color coded, but it's a nice visual. In the bottom left, there's a calculation for the maximum applied water allowance, or MAWA, and that's giving the amount of gallons of water you're allowed to use annually based on the project's evapotranspiration rate, which is based on the location and the landscape area. And then you'll compare that to the proposed usage, which is based on plant type and irrigation efficiency. And this just needs to be included somewhere in the landscape plans. A lot of times we see it with the irrigation plan or planting plan, and it's also required for public schools, community colleges, and healthcare facilities. And that's it for the water section. So for materials, we have rodent proofing. Um, so CalGreen asks to rodent seal all penetrations with materials like cement mortar, concrete, or similar, not using foam. And for weather protection, provide a weather-resistant exterior wall and foundation envelope as required by the CBC. For moisture control, this one's, making sure your sprinklers don't spray on the buildings. And for exterior entries and openings to prevent water intrusion, this one we sometimes see missed. So for primary doors, making sure you have non-absorbent flooring within 2 feet around the opening, and then the awning or overhang 4 feet deep, or having the door recessed 4 feet. Sometimes we catch that one that gets missed, but that's an important one as well. Construction waste reduction, at least 65%. This excludes a hazardous waste. For this, you'll need a waste management plan and a statement of results. And make sure to check if you have a local ordinance, because some places have higher than 65% threshold. And there's also an optional pathway proving that you have reduced generation. We don't see that one as much. Usually, projects are just doing the 65% threshold. For universal waste additions, alterations, you need to make sure that those are diverted from the waste stream. And excavated soil and land clearing debris, 100% must be reused or recycled. So for the documentation for these, add the requirements to the notes on the plan set. All right, so it is now required as part of the CalGreen Code to address embodied carbon. This was not part of the 2022 code. It was introduced as the intervening code cycle in July of 2024 for projects 100,000 square feet or schools 50,000 square feet. Now in the 2025 code, it is reduced to a 50,000 square foot threshold for all non-residential projects. There are 3 pathways to compliance, and we will briefly be walking you through each of these. They are building reuse, life cycle analysis, and the prescriptive path. And right now, the building reuse option is located under the planning and design section, but it's going to be moved to materials with the other pathways in the next code cycle so that they're all in the same place. Okay, to understand each pathway, we need to know what embodied carbon is, where it shows up in the construction process, and the scope for looking at each of these pathways. Embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of building materials. We don't want to get this confused with operational carbon, which is related to the greenhouse gas emissions due to building energy consumption, which is probably the type of carbon emissions you're more used to hearing about. So you may or may not have seen a chart like this before, but it shows where you'll find carbon in the construction process. The cradle to gate scope looks at the product stage. This is your raw materials, extraction, transportation, and manufacturing. It's all the things that go into making the product. This is the scope you're looking at for the prescriptive pathway. Next is cradle to grave. This includes that product stage, but also construction, use, and end of life stages. This is the scope included for the whole building life cycle assessment. And last is cradle to cradle, which includes the whole cradle to grave scope, but additionally includes beyond the building life cycle, things like recycling or reuse, which is where the building reuse pathway comes into play. So looking at a little more detailed overview, we have our building reuse options for additions, where the addition is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. The mandatory measure requires 45% of the structure and enclosure to be reused. Next is the whole building life cycle analysis. This is the modeling pathway where you'll need to show a 10% reduction in embodied carbon from a baseline building. Last is the prescriptive pathway, which targets carbon reductions in specific materials. For the mandatory measure, this limits the global warming potential to 175% of the industry-wide average from environmental product declarations, or APDs. This is an example of documenting the reuse of an existing building pathway. Again, this method is for additions or alterations where the addition is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. So for our example here, we have a 45,000 square foot existing building and an 80,000 square foot addition. We can get super into the weeds on this stuff, but for now, I'm going to keep this as a quicker overview and you can review the slides later. This method targets primary structural elements and building enclosure materials, as seen on the bottom left, excluding hazardous materials, as well as windows and insulation. And that's to encourage replacing the windows and insulation with higher performing materials. So this is how you'll do the, oh, sorry. This is how you'll do the quick calculation and documentation. You'll make a spreadsheet listing the areas and then enter the areas for the materials that will be retained, add those up and drop them in the worksheet below, which is provided by CalGreen. For this example, we can see that we're retaining 54.57%. And as a reminder, the total percentage just needs to exceed 45%. For the second method, this is the whole building life cycle assessment. Again, this is the modeling pathway. It's very similar to an energy model, but instead of measuring energy use, it measures embodied carbon. So again, it's that cradle to grave scope over a reference study period of 60 years. You're looking at the same materials as the building reuse method, except the time including glazing and insulation. And there's a lot of questions about how to generate a baseline building to compare the design building to. And the reference building or the baseline building should have the same location, orientation, size, function, and space conditioning as the proposed to ensure you're just comparing the materials. And then the materials baseline should be based off of what a typical building design for a project of that type in that location would have. So we've listed some tools here below. Athena and One-Click LCA are free tools. And there are paid software options as well, such as Sphera, SEMA and Tally. Tally has a Revit plugin. So if you have a good Revit model already built, it can be imported into that program so the model doesn't have to be built from scratch. And this is an example of what a project looks like in Athena. It's a typical trunk and branch structure, again, similar to an energy model. You'll go through and describe building assemblies through dialog boxes that request information like base sizes and loads, and the software does the rest for you. It calculates a bill of materials and the associated environmental impacts. And users have the flexibility to add materials as needed or import your own bill of materials from any CAD program. And CalGreen also provides a worksheet for this method where you input the values that come out of the assessment to display compliance. The last of the three pathways for embodied carbon is the prescriptive path. This method has a much more limited scope, targeting some of the more high impact materials as determined by the Buy Clean California program, like certain types of steel, glass, insulation, and of course, concrete. This table here shows the maximum acceptable global warming potential value, or GWP, which is based off of industry-wide averages. For the products on the top half of the chart, you just need to find products with a GWP below what is allowed. For concrete on the bottom half, compliance is determined by a weighted calculation. Each type of concrete has a different allowed GWP value and will have a different actual GWP. So to determine compliance, you'll follow this equation, multiply the actual GWP with the volume used, and add those together to get the total carbon impact. Then do the same for the GWP allowed. And then you just need to make sure your actual GWP is lower than the allowed. And product data for each material will be found on environmental product declarations, or EPDs, an example of which can be seen here. Generally, they have the GWP value in the very first row. Now, most of us might not be working on 50,000 square foot buildings where the embodied carbon requirement is triggered by code. But as we can see, they're starting to bring down that square footage threshold. And over time, we can expect it to be relevant to a wider variety of projects. So we want to start thinking about strategies addressing embodied carbon now so that when it is required for your projects, you're already familiar with it. So this slide has a lot of words. I'm not going to go into depth on each one, but it's calling out some high impact material categories for cost-effective low carbon product selection. Generally speaking, concrete and steel are typically the places that many projects find as great areas for potential embodied carbon reduction at no or low cost premium. And this slide here displays embodied carbon of some different insulation materials. Some are shown as more net carbon emitting, others are net carbon sequestering. Not all insulation works for all conditions, of course, but where a substitution is feasible, charts like this can act as a guide to select alternative products. And insulation's an interesting one. There's a lot of options for material replacements. There are emerging technologies. We have some other examples here, like the expanded cork, a mycelium board, and wood fiber board. Those are all good options for embodied carbon reduction. And I think I'm gonna pass it back to Andy now.
Great. Thank you, Tatiana. Just a couple last loose ends within the materials section of CalGreen. Operation and maintenance manual being provided to the building owner or representative. That is required. Again, it's one of those where I think it's a super helpful document that may or may not be the priority of the team, depending. It's allowed to be online. It can be a cloud-based manual, but it does need to have have the instructions for operations and warranties. They've added in 2022 defensible space, so kind of a fire resiliency section there, and a lot of other information is specifically called out in that manual. In the world of non-residential, commissioning is kind of the tool where we can require these types of owner O&M manual. Recycling by occupants is required, or providing a space for occupants to recycle is required. And so if you have 5 units or more of multifamily, you have to have recycling and organic waste collection on site, or whatever is local. And within non-res, you need to make sure that you have enough of, if you're adding for a non-res, then it also needs to have adequate recycling space. Organics are required for like restaurants to, there's a certain volume that require you to have kind of a green waste organics capacity. So just make sure that there's space for that as well. Commissioning is that circle of accountability. And this is, a lot of folks think of it, this is kind of like, the punch list at the end to make sure everything works, but it starts much sooner. The code requires that there are these upfront documents in terms of owner project requirements and the basis of design. Those are done before design even starts, and then design development. Then the commissioning authority reviews those documents and make sure that those requirements are included in the design itself. Depending on the size and complexity of the job, it triggers a design review, either internally or third party, and then a commissioning plan. What are we going to check and when? And then toward the end of the construction, that's when you verify the performance, and the commissioning report circles all the way back. Is the light level, air movement, operability in alignment with that OPR in the first place, right? So commissioning has this full circle that needs to have a thread of continuity. So full commissioning with all of these requirements are for new buildings that are 10,000 square feet or greater, non-residential. And within that, submitted for permit, all of these things, OPR, BOD, the commissioning requirements in the permit set, and the commissioning plan itself should all be submitted as part of the permit package. Then the rest of this is done during construction. There's not a formal submittal at construction, but inspectors are within their right to request the final document. But it's really the permitting that says, hey, we commit to doing the testing that's required for commissioning. Interesting that this is one of those areas where the Energy Code and CALGreen have a pretty strong overlap, but slight differences. So this is the non-residential building commissioning form, NRCC CXRE. But it's important to note, so you should do this also for non-residential projects. One is that Part 6 requires a design review for projects under 10,000 square feet. So whereas CALGreen says you can just do your regular test and balance, you should have a plan, but if it's under 10,000 square feet, no commissioning. But Energy Code says you still need to do this form for the smaller projects. You just don't have to do the whole commissioning plan, et cetera. But there is still a design review, internal. But then once you get over 10,000 square feet, CALGreen requires commissioning of irrigation and PVs, but the Energy Code does not. So a little bit of a mix and match there. We tend to just do all of it each time to make sure that we're covered, and it ends up being super cost effective to make sure that the building is operating the way it's supposed to. And then again, back to just CALGreen, if the system is under 10,000 square feet, it's a testing and adjusting. And it does require a plan in order to do that, often developed by the engineer in the first place. So make sure that that plan is included in notes or specifications. Before we go into environmental, there were a couple of good questions back at the EV charging and the planning and design stage. One asked, if you remove a canopy, is that going to trigger the kind of alteration requirement? And I would say it depends in the sense that the intent there of CalGreen and the alterations of parking lots is if you are tearing up a parking lot, then while you're there, please add conduit and or charging stations, etc. So if you are taking off a canopy and leaving the foundation and the base in place and you're just like unbolting and removing, then I would say no, that wouldn't trigger alteration. Um, but if you're kind of tearing up the lot to remove something and then do some reconfiguring, yes, that would be an alteration. So good question there. And then there was a question of that the relic that we used to have for charging, which was not for charging, but those clean air vehicles, the what did we call them? The preferred parking, right, for clean air vehicles. And so somebody noted that those are kind of this legacy that are still out there, and do we still need to enforce them? I'll be curious if other people weigh in. Maybe once we finish, we can stop sharing and somebody can have that conversation, because I'm not sure what to do with a legacy like that. Obviously, if they're doing new striping, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you'd have to keep that. So not as useful. Those spaces anymore. So, okay. So last main section here within our five areas is the indoor air quality. And fireplaces, of course, need to be, if it's a gas, direct vent, sealed combustion, and then otherwise they all need to just kind of meet the US EPA standards or local ordinance. Within temporary ventilation, the system needs to be MERV 13 if you're using it temporarily. That's new. It used to be that permanent ventilation would require MERV 13, but MERV 8 was allowed. Now MERV 13 is required throughout. And that's important also to know up front because it does impact the design of the mechanical system. I think everybody's on board with a permanent anyway. Again, for indoor air quality, covering of duct openings and protecting mechanical equipment during construction. So once you have installed the ducts and you're waiting for the other construction, you should cover the end. So tight air seal like that. These are all bad. So they just kind of like crunch them in a little, try to stick some foam. Obviously, fine powder is going to get in there. This one's all smashed up and doesn't have it. So the idea is that with that open duct, if the little bit of dust gets in from construction, sweeping compound, drywall, sanding, any of those things, if it gets into the duct and sits there and then there's any kind of moisture during operation, that's just food for mold growth. So very unhealthy. So ducts should arrive with the ends covered and equipment should stay covered. And then if they need to do the work, then they add ducts and then cover at the end. So really important one. It's not required by code, but pipes. We had a commissioning authority who always covered pipes because open pipes of a relatively small size, you can actually, little critters can get in there and get stuck. And obviously that's a nightmare as well in terms of health. Pollutant control hasn't changed for several code cycles at this point in the sense of these categories: adhesives, carpet, resilient floor, paints and coatings, composite wood. They did add a couple code cycles, last code cycle, insulation, ceiling tiles, wall panels. You can demonstrate compliance using one of these. There's an actual VOC limit, or you can use one of these green guard, green label kinds of compliance on plans. Again, thankfully, this is pretty routine. I would say the things that are tricky have been problematic if somebody uses an outdoor a product intended for outdoor, if they use it in the building, like somebody used a roofing adhesive to kind of tack carpet down, that did not meet the indoor air quality standards. Thankfully, they didn't use very much of it, so we were able to show kind of a balance overall for the whole building. But building inspectors, you're well within your rights to ask for documentation. It does say that you should have certificates of compliance for all those low emitting products. Within the world of no smoking, again, a surprisingly challenging labeling that Tatiana and I find. The specific requirement is no smoking within 25 feet of building entries, outdoor intakes, or operable windows. And you can do this either by not allowing anybody to smoke within 25 feet of the building or on the whole site. Or you can have a designated smoking area, but you do need signage. So this one says this establishment is smoke-free. Maybe, but not quite. Like, do they mean like this building? Can they just stand outside the door and smoke? That's what we see a lot of. This one, no smoking within 25 feet of all building entrances, but it doesn't talk about windows or air intakes. And so then this is the kind that has all the specific language that would be required. So again, there's different labeling that you can do, but just needs to be super clear about where people can or cannot smoke outside of the building. Just making sure again that there's specific requirements about concrete slab foundations and capillary breaks so that we don't get mold growth underneath the slab that's coming through. So you need the vapor retarder and capillary break or as specified by an engineer. Again, been in the code a long time. Moisture content of buildings. Again, certainly an inspector with one of these moisture meters checking to make sure that nothing is getting enclosed with if it's higher than 19% moisture content. And obviously visible water damage. So making sure that if you have those products on site, that they're covered, wrapped, not exposed to moisture and or allowed to dry out. CALGreen is where we also talk about bathroom exhaust fans. So those are for bathrooms that have a tub or shower. So it needs to be exhausted to the exterior, has to be Energy Star compliant, and it has to be, it can be used as a part of a whole house ventilation, but the bathroom one needs to have a humidistat. Heating and air conditioning system design. This is covered in the building code, in the energy code. CALGreen's little piece of that is just saying if you're installing an HVAC system, you can use ASHRAE engineering standards, but you can also use ACA manuals J, D, and S. If they are using ACA manuals J, D, and S, so one is J is figuring out what the loads are, S is selecting the right sized equipment, and D is the actual duct layout. So those three all work together. If it's an unducted system, of course, you don't need D. But it is trying to counter the 3-bedroom house needs this size. So, and that just, oversized equipment doesn't perform as well. Undersized equipment obviously may not provide the levels of thermal comfort that are safe. So it's important to get these right sized. And there's different programs that will generate this duct layout kind of system. So make sure that you get the drawings and the calculations. Other loose ends within indoor air quality is outside air, carbon dioxide monitoring with CO2 sensors, and then now a new requirement, last code cycle, DSA added CO2 monitoring in all classrooms, and this code cycle, California decided this was a good idea everywhere for classrooms. So universities, private schools, all must have CO2 monitoring in the classrooms. Acoustic control, this is one where some years ago it wasn't, in the green building world, acoustics wasn't really part of it, but they started to understand that the negative health impacts of noise interruption. And so now acoustic control is part of CalGreen. And so multi-tenant spaces require a sound transmission class STC of 40. That's, kind of Midland. It's nothing too crazy. So for walls and floor ceiling assemblies separating a tenant space. So in this example, the tenant on the right was doing the build out. They made the wall in between to make sure it had an STC 40 for whoever would end up moving next door. So separating tenant spaces, public spaces. So if there's a hallway, that needs to have that same STC 40. And you can use, different acoustic insulation materials, different kinds of framing, other ways to wall finishes themselves might have an acoustic treatment. So these are isolating, not managing reverberation time. This is sound isolation. And then kind of on the flip side, if there's a lot of exterior noise due to an airport or freeway or train, then the walls and roof also require a little bit higher STC of 50, and then the windows have a STC of 40 or an OITC of 30. And these contour maps are available in the noise element of the jurisdiction. Yeah. And then within the ozone depletion, greenhouse gas reductions, there's a few about no CFCs, no halons, of course. Those have all been blocked. And then, but now looking to supermarket refrigeration, they've been finding that that's one of the sources of potential leaks in refrigerant. So if you have a retail food store, 8,000 square feet or more of conditioned area, and you have refrigerated displays, then you need to make sure that you have leak reduction measures. So those are the mandatory measures. And then just quickly, we're doing okay. Yeah, we're right on time here to be able to touch on the appendices and other loose ends here. So that was chapters 4 and 5 are the mandatory residential, non-residential. Chapter 6 has current links to all the references, so that's helpful. 7 covers special inspections and some cleanup with a consistency of the code language. And then chapter 8 has these handy dandy forms for doing a water budget, construction waste management, that whole life cycle analysis that Tatiana was talking about, commissioning. Sorry for all the acronyms there. And so you'll be able to find a lot of resources. So those are helpful. And then it goes into the tiers, the appendices. So the voluntary tiers, again, similar to LEED, you have to do all the mandatory measures. And then in tier 1, they add a few more mandatory measures, and then you get to choose how many of the other ones are good and applicable to your project. So in planning and design, now there's 4 new mandatory measures in addition to all the others, and you pick up 2 electives. And then if you want tier 2, it's that more mandatory and more electives, right? So it just kind of goes through the mandatory and electives for each of these sections. Non-residential, same structure, just different mandatory and electives. And so a lot of times we find that something that was in tier 1 gets bumped to mandatory. So like the insulation, low emitting insulation and some of the other low emitting used to be a tier 1 mandatory, and then they moved it to mandatory. So we kind of keep an eye on those, even though we don't necessarily see a lot of jurisdictions adopting the tiers outright. We see bits and pieces, and then also we see that it maybe is a jurisdiction's approach to allowing maybe expedited plan check or a height allowance. You get an additional floor if you meet tier 2 or something like that. Here's one that showed up last year or last cycle in the electives. So bird-friendly building design. So 90% of the building elevation would incorporate bird-friendly mitigation strategies. And that's atriums, glass rails. Obviously, we're seeing with kind of a more high density, higher buildings with a lot of glass stylistically that we're also seeing bird kills. So they're trying to see if there's ways where we can encourage and maybe at some point require that that glazing either has visual markers or patterns or a glass block that has channels, or there's some other technologies that are marketed. I don't know if they work, or slats or screens or nettings or louvers or some way that you are preventing birds from thinking that that's more sky and trees and flying into it. So to wrap up, and then we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A, the CCRN has a lot of great resources. If you go to the website, there's a codes and standards program. And if you click under there, you'll get the Energy Code Coach and all the training classes. For the Energy Code Coach, again, we're proud to be able to provide that program service. So if you fill out that form and what your question is on the energy code or CALGreen, it comes right to us and we can answer your question. It could be anything from, does this ADU trigger PVs, or what's the deal with how many EV chargers I need, or even energy modeling. Sometimes we'll get questions, or how to fill out a CF2R, 3R, those types of things. So happy to help with any of that. These are upcoming courses that you'll be able to register online. That'll be up later this week or early next week. So I'd like to single out in particular this Energy Code Roundtable for building departments. We're doing one in July that's going to focus on heat pump water heaters. And then in October, we'll go to CF1Rs, 2Rs, and 3Rs, cheers, registry, all those types of things. And we're kind of opening this up to y'all to be able to talk about, we said heat pump water heaters. We'll have just a few slides on to kind of start the conversation going. But if you have any questions that you want to make sure we address, or just want to be part of the conversation, we'd love to have you there. And then we have some other classes coming up as well. With that, I'll turn it over to Jess. I think she's going to launch a poll, and then we can open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy and Tatiana. That was awesome. Really appreciate all of your knowledge. And I actually have good news. We just got our website updated. So if you are interested in these upcoming courses, you can visit ccrn.org/codes. I did also drop the schedule into the chat. The registration links are there as well. So please do feel free to sign up for any of those upcoming classes. And then before you go, we do just really appreciate your feedback. So I'm launching a quick Zoom poll. It's 3 questions, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have any suggestions of how to make these trainings more useful for you, we'd love to hear from you. We also have the opportunity to provide custom training. So if you are working for a building department, or if your team could use some training courses, please do reach out to us. You can contact us at codes@ccrn.org. You can also reply to any of the emails that you receive from me, but we'd love to support you all. And yeah, there's definitely some great opportunities coming up. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for participating in the Zoom poll. It is definitely an important part of how we're able to provide these no-cost courses. So thank you for your feedback. Yeah, and if anyone has questions, I'm happy to stay on. I think we've got some time, so.
Great, thank you. I do want to circle back just to see, this is more of a, building official kind of question comment about the enforcing of If you were permitted under the 2019 or earlier codes, there was a requirement for these preferred parking spaces for clean air vehicles. The code dropped that altogether in 2022 as they started to bring on the actual EV charging. But is it useful to keep those other ones going? I don't know. Does anybody have an answer for that? Feel free to unmute and chime in. Guess it'll remain a mystery, perhaps.
Hi,
Okay.
Andy. This is,
All right.
oh,
I'll chime in. I'm Brian Odom here. My take on it is if the original use is still in play, then it would all be enforceable. If it was designed and you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah,
Right
that
on.
was code at the time. And if
If
it's,
this, if,
yeah,
if yeah, so if you design your business with that, it falls right along the lines of right on down to the landscaping. If they're going to make any changes on the site in any way, it's all enforceable under the original conditions of improvement of the project.
yeah.
So
Okay.
you can't just go erase it, and you can't just go erase an ADA spot either, just because you
Right.
want to make a change. So it's all enforceable.
Right. So unless you were actually doing an alteration and then complying with the new code for
That's right.
actual EV charging, then you can, dump
That,
the old ones and make the compliant with the new code. But you can't just, just because it's
right.
not really helpful
Yeah.
anymore. It still might be. I mean, people still might get some use out of it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, it could be, but who are we to make that determination? So,
Yeah.
that's kind of how I see it, and that's how I would enforce it. So,
Yeah. Thank you, Brian.
yeah.
Rachel, did you want to weigh in?
oh, sure. Yes, since I put that comment in the chat. So we definitely still have all of our um, clean air vehicle spaces designated and striped, but it's our parking operators don't really know how to enforce it anymore because originally they were looking for the California Clean Air Vehicle decal stickers. But since those
Right.
stickers are going away, they'd have to have a list, they're saying, of, every new clean air vehicle that came out and make and model. So I was just curious if other folks were facing those
Ah, I see.
challenges.
I was asking the wrong question. So you're keeping the spaces, but now, do you look, it's like, okay, I think that's EV or that's a Prius. Does that count? Or if they
Exactly.
don't have a sticker, how do you know which ones can qualify or not? Yeah, good one. Okay, I'm gonna look it up. I will check to see what the current list is. That's a great question.
We can certainly include that in our follow-up email with the
Yeah, there you go.
slides and the recording and any additional information we find on that.
Right, right. I mean, happily, I think more and more would qualify, but I don't know if they've upped the standard of what qualifies. So, great question. Anything else? Any snags that people are finding? Anything else you want us to take up? Not seeing any other questions. You will get the slides, you'll get the recording, and I think we did it. All right, we'll give you a few minutes of your life back, and thanks everyone for joining us. Look forward to
Love it.
seeing you next time.
Thank you all, and feel free to shoot us an email if you'd like a certificate for the learning units for today's course. So thanks
Thanks.
again.